Hi everyone, and welcome to the second video in a mini-series where I'll be exploring the Final Fantasy VII compilation lore and Easter eggs that appear in episode Intermission. I'm MJ Gallagher, author of books such as Norse Myths that inspired Final Fantasy VII and The Nibelheim Incident, an award-winning project produced in association with Kupukon. Like my main series breaking down the chapters of Final Fantasy VII Remake, all of which can be found on Kupukon's YouTube channel, the purpose of these videos is to highlight a lot of the detail hidden within Intermission, and to provide a broader understanding for new and veteran fans alike. In this episode, I'll be examining Yuffie's introduction to Avalanche HQ in Chapter 1 of the DLC, it's self-titled Wutai's Finest. Just as a forewarning, the video will be spoiler heavy for this part of Intermission, Remake in general, and the wider compilation of Final Fantasy VII. And if you're new to my channel, please don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell. It should not really have come as a surprise to anyone that Yuffie emerges from the outskirts of the Sector 7 Undercity into Scrap Boulevard, a rocky area adjacent to the slums, where Cloud and Tifa come to get rid of some monsters for the Neighbourhood Watch during Chapter 3 of Remake. From here, Yuffie makes her way into the shanty town itself, pausing when she sees a Shinra news report regarding the bombing at Mako Reactor 5. This act, of course, had been carried out by Cloud, Barret and Tifa. The media report is the same one broadcast on the Jumbotron of Centre District during Chapter 8 of Remake, thus establishing a time frame for Intermission. It's also a subtle introduction to Scarlet, Shinra's Director of Advanced Weaponry, who features prominently in Chapter 2 of the DLC. Yuffie is soon called away from the crowd by Zhizha, who holds up a Moogle hat like the one she's wearing, to identify himself as her liaison. The official Square Enix website and Famitsu articles provided some background to Zhizha's character in advance of Intermission's release, noting that he is a Wutai native who lives in Midgar, and acts as a point of contact between the new Wutai government and Avalanche HQ. When Yuffie asks Zhizha why he didn't come to meet her, he refers to Yuffie as an elite W agent. As it turns out, W is a codename for someone who lives in Wutai, where Yuffie just came from. Minor as this might sound, it's yet another confirmation that the girl's backstory in Remake seems to have been retconned. The official timelines in Final Fantasy VII media show that Yuffie left her home nation sometime in the year 3 of the New Era, which, for those unfamiliar with the terminology, is 4 years prior to current events. Therefore, to have just come from Wutai means things have changed. And speaking of retcons, Yuffie also tells Zhizha that she has never been to Midgar before. This contradicts two of the soldier side missions in Crisis Core, specifically after completing missions 864 and 865. Where Yuffie emails Zack to inform him she's in danger, somewhere in the Midgar slums and Plate respectively. In a bit of lore that will shock absolutely no one, the young girl's correspondence with Zack sends him hunting for materia and other various treasures on her behalf. As Yuffie and Zhizha approach Avalanche HQ's hideout, Jessie, Biggs and Wedge can be seen and heard just ahead. They're worried that Barret, Cloud and Tifa haven't made it back to the slums yet, but Biggs notes the news reports have not mentioned anyone being caught. This again helps to establish the time frame for the DLC, but it's also a clever way to remind players that the others were caught during Chapter 7 of Remake and only escaped after defeating the Airbuster, which I'll come back to in the next episode. More specifically, it draws attention to President Shinra's remarks in that chapter that Avalanche are allies of Wicked Wutai, which, as it turns out through Intermission, is actually true. and their current base is literally yards away. In terms of the exterior to Avalanche HQ's hideout, there are a couple of points to highlight. The first is the Moogle doll on the chair. 3 variations of the Moogle design have appeared across the compilation of Final Fantasy VII. The first is in the original game, seen in the Choco Mog summon, and also the Mog's House minigame at the Gold Saucer. The second design appears as dolls like the one on the chair, both in Advent Children and in Dirge of Cerberus. The third variant is the remake style seen on Yuffie's hat, and in the directional posters throughout the undeveloped land earlier in the chapter. The inclusion of this doll type provides a connection to the compilation, and specifically to Deep Ground, because a similar Moogle doll floating on the Mako pools was used in Dirge of Cerberus as a visual representation for their mass slaughter of Calm's citizens, coordinated by Nero the Sable. As was revealed in the teaser trailers for episode Intermission, Nero and Deep Ground will play a significant role later in the DLC. There's also another, admittedly more abstract Easter egg on the building's exterior, and that is the sign that reads Sector 7 Clinic. In the Yuffie chapter of the official novel On the Way to a Smile, the teenage ninja returns to Wutai after the defeat of Sephiroth and Meteor. Despite her request for many of the party's materia, Cloud agrees to let her take 1 orb of healing materia, so that she can use it to help restore her hometown post Meteor Fall. She does so by setting up a temporary hospital, curing those injured during the livestream's eruption, and calls herself Dr. Yuffie. To have her initial destination in Intermission be a clinic, not to mention her only equipped magic materia is a healing orb when the DLC begins, seems a bit too coincidental. In the basement of Avalanche's hideout, Jija introduces Yuffie to HQ members Billy Bob, Polk and Nio. In the months preceding Intermission's launch, many community members, myself included, speculated that this trio was the same as the Avalanche characters Al, Finn and Nelly that Barrett mentions during his resolution scene in Remake's Chapter 14, and I'll come back to this in a minute. Yuffie goes on to ask about Sonon, another Wutai operative who has been sent to assist her on the assignment to steal Shinra's ultimate materia, and is annoyed to learn he has been out enjoying city life in Midgar. Keep this in mind, as there is a good reason the girl is sensitive to the idea of drinking in bars, which I'll talk about shortly. Yuffie then pulls out a few Dachau beans from her pouch and gives one to each of the Avalanche members. The key items screen describes the beans as exceptionally tough legumes packed with nutrients, which indicates they are a compact, high energy food source for travelling ninjas. Dachau, of course, is a principal deity in Wutai, with several monuments to his various avatars, or perhaps simply other unnamed gods or heroes, carved from the mountain above the nation's capital. Biting into the beans causes Polk and Billy Bob to hurt their teeth, and Yuffie shows off by munching a few in one go. This may be an intended display of strength on her part, especially because she has a bad history with Avalanche, as I'll explain at the end of the video. Note that Jija slyly puts his bean on the table behind him, which is an important point for the next episode. So who exactly are Nio, Billy Bob and Polk? Again, thanks to the official Square Enix website and an associated Famitsu article published in April 2021, we have a very brief background for each. Nio was born in the slums and is now the quartermaster for Avalanche HQ. That is to say, she's an officer who oversees the acquisition and distribution of supplies for the group. Her Famitsu profile confirms it was the Wutai government who reached out first, and she helped them devise a strategy for Yuffie's covert mission. At this point, it's probably a good idea to establish exactly who Avalanche HQ are. We know from the loading screen panels throughout Remake that HQ is the core, non-militant branch of the planetologist organisation, distinct from, and predating, Barrett's Splinter Cell. It may not have been obvious to casual players of the original Final Fantasy VII, especially in the international versions of the game, that Barrett was not the founder of Avalanche. The Ultimania Omega further clarified that his group was not even the first incarnation. As it happens, the larger faction of environmental terrorists are the main antagonists of Before Crisis, with that Japanese-only mobile game providing a basic history for them. The so-called Old Guard Avalanche cell that appears in Chapter 4 of Remake seems to be derived from the organisation in Before Crisis, based on their military-grade uniforms and weapons. While separate to the more extremist branches of Avalanche, HQ has, until very recently, had open communication with the others. As revealed during Remake, however, that association was severed after Barrett's cell bombed Mako Reactor 1. For the purposes of the plot, Avalanche HQ and Barrett's cell should be considered totally independent of each other. It's also important to highlight from the character profiles of Avalanche HQ that they are said to be in hiding at the time of intermission, suggesting the Sector 7 clinic is not their normal base of operations. The reason they are in hiding is most probably because of the unwanted attention the Reactor 1 bombing drew from the Shinra security forces. Anyway, during Barrett's resolution scene in Remake's Chapter 14, he mentions a character called Nelly, the quartermaster for Midgar's Avalanche cell. He says Nelly has a close relationship with Jessie, and the two are similar enough to be mistaken for sisters. With the exception of her name appearing on the darts scoreboard found in 7th Heaven, Nelly is not referenced anywhere else in Remake. Given the parallels between all this and Nio, it would be reasonable to presume they're the same person, but there are a few unanswered questions about that. When Yuffie speaks to Nio, she admits she is uncertain exactly where Shinra are keeping the so-called ultimate materia, but suspects it's in the basement of the Shinra building, because that's where the Advanced Weaponry Division is located. This corresponds with a scene from Chapter 16 of Remake, where Scarlet's materia research facility is shown to be on level B13. Nio also mentions that Sonon is likely to have gone to Wall Market, but hesitates in describing the seedy nature of the town, because Yuffie, of course, is still only 16. The extent of Wall Market's depravity is explored a little during Chapter 9 of Remake. Once again, Yuffie's reaction shows that she has a negative perception of bars, remarking that they are smoky and filled with adults complaining about young people. She then refers specifically to an establishment like that in Wutai, where grown-ups drink their lives away, called the Happy Turtle. Nio says that there's a Happy Turtle in Midgar as well, telling Yuffie about their flyers and about Old Snapper, but I'll discuss his role in the next video. What's interesting about this is that there seems to be a distinction between the Happy Turtle chain and the Turtle's Paradise bar that appeared in the original Final Fantasy VII. The latter, of course, is where the player can claim their reward for completing the Turtle's Paradise poster side quest, which I'll also come back to in the next episode. The distinction is reflected in Crisis Core, where the Happy Turtle is actually a materia shop. As for why Yuffie gets sassy about older people drinking in smoky bars, INTERmission has started laying the foundations of a seriously troubled relationship between the girl and her father, Godo Kisaragi, who is presented in Final Fantasy VII as the leader of Wutai. However, there's quite a lot of new information to unravel as the DLC progresses, so I'll address it properly in a later video. Billy Bob is another character who is new to Intermission, but whose name might be an alias. Like Nio, he was born in the slums and is a very experienced member of Avalanche. He helps to gather intelligence for the branch and often does so in bars, because his special talent is being able to remain sober no matter how much he drinks. In Chapter 14 of Remake, Barrett makes reference to an Avalanche intel guy called Al, who had tricks for obtaining information that Barrett couldn't work out. Given Barrett's connection to Seventh Heaven, it's very likely that he and Billy Bob have crossed paths. If you continue speaking to Billy Bob, he will remark that he may have broken a tooth on the Dechow beans. He goes on to ask Yuffie how crazy her ninja training was. What's maybe worth highlighting at this point, for anyone who was confused by it, is that the term shinobi does not appear anywhere in Intermission, despite it being used in non-English promotional material in the context of Wutai's elite special forces. The reason for this is quite simply that the archaic word shinobi is typically interchangeable with the more modern ninja or ninjas, but it also relates to an historic group of imperial spies from feudal Japan, who were proficient in espionage and ninjutsu. The implication here is that the elite special forces are referred to in general as ninjas. Furthermore, the title of Yuffie's theme music, Descendant of Shinobi, the track currently playing in the video, also indicates that she comes from a long line of ninjas. And that brings us to Polk, the youngest of the three Avalanche members. Polk also comes from Midgar's Undercity and is treated like a little brother by the rest of the crew. His area of expertise is strategy, which is why he has taken a keen interest in the new Fort Condor game. Fort Condor is yet another topic I'll come back to in the next episode. During his scene in Chapter 14, Barrett additionally speaks about a young man named Finn, calling him lazy but a tremendous artist. The stamp graffiti found in the passages around Midgar are all credited to Finn, and are used by Avalanche to guide their comrades. As I mentioned in the last video, the Avalanche liaison's use of Moogle posters adopts the same tactic, and, lo and behold, there is one such poster on the desk behind Polk. I'll leave you guys to make up your own mind on whether you think Nio, Billy Bob and Polk are actually just aliases of Nelly, Al and Finn. This corner of the basement also bears another couple of interesting features. The first is what seems to be Shinra ammunition tins. While Avalanche HQ are a non-militant branch, it is not beyond them to acquire things like ammo or gunpowder, as we learn from Jesse during Remake. Specifically, we know the warehouse in the Sector 7 Plates residential area has already been targeted by Avalanche. Above the desk is a flag with the stylish new Avalanche logo on it, which is significantly different to the original game's symbol for Barrett's cell. That design was a capital A on a skull and crossbones, and the only place it could really be seen in the old Final Fantasy VII was on a flag in the hidden basement of 7th Heaven. When you think about it, the Avalanche flag, the whiteboard with floor plans, the TV, the cardboard boxes, the 2 male and 1 female teammates, and even a Moogle doll in place of Marlene, all seems pretty reminiscent of Cloud's visit to the 7th Heaven hideout in the original. The whiteboard itself is also something of an Easter egg for Cloud & Co.'s infiltration of the Shinra building in Chapter 16 of Remake. The plans were actually visible during the Intermission reveal trailer back in February 2021, so this might not come as a surprise to some fans. The large illustration in the centre of the board is the main lobby of Shinra headquarters, while the 2 images in the top right corner are floor plans of the corporate archives on the 62nd floor and the recreational facility on the 63rd floor respectively. There are 3 known Avalanche collaborators that make contact with Cloud in Chapter 16. These are Mayor Domino and his assistant Hart in the corporate archives, and a staffer in the recreational facility. It's unclear at this time what extent these plans relate to the military branch of Avalanche's assault on the Shinra building in Chapter 17, designed to flush out the president. What is certain is that Avalanche HQ is involved in that, as confirmed by Wedge when he speaks to the party from Domino's office. As such, the whiteboard is very possibly a remnant from the early development of INTERmission's plot, because concept artwork contained within the DLC's digital artbook indicates that Yuffie was originally intended to team up with the so-called Old Guard Avalanche. And speaking of Old Guard, I'm going to finish this video by discussing Yuffie's history with Avalanche from the compilation of Final Fantasy VII. It's stated in official timelines that the Extremist Wing, the primary antagonists of Before Crisis, led by Alpha and Fajito and financed by Vice President Rufus Shinra, established their headquarters in a pagoda in Wutai's capital, during the period where the nation's war with the Shinra Company was reaching its climax. Despite their proximity, however, there was never any significant association between Wutai and Avalanche. Over the next 3 years, Yuffie, a trainee ninja, frustrates Avalanche combatants by sneaking around the hidden passages of their pagoda. She hates the organisation and wants revenge on them, because she believes they are also responsible for Wutai's post-war decline. During episode 14 of Before Crisis, Yuffie assists the player Turk in escaping Avalanche's headquarters, after she herself has pressed the detonator to blow up the pagoda. When she learns that the player Turk is a Shinra operative, Yuffie is aghast, reiterating her contempt for the company. She claims in the original Final Fantasy VII that she was disgusted by how her father Godo had allowed Wutai to become nothing more than a resort town. In every compilation entry, Yuffie confirms it's her ambition to restore pride and glory to Wutai, most commonly through the acquisition of powerful materia. However, while her ultimate goal has not changed in INTERmission, her affiliation with Wutai's military has, as I referenced in my previous video. There is a very clear allusion to the events of Before Crisis later in this chapter though, which means that, until Remake tells us otherwise, we can assume that element of her past is canon. As such, Yuffie likely still hates Avalanche, which might explain her attitude in some of these scenes. That said, she at least seems to appreciate the fact that Shinra is their common enemy. So what about this new relationship between Wutai and Avalanche? In Chapter 4 of Remake, Biggs tells Cloud that the Old Guard are rumoured to have cut a deal with Wutai. Essentially, in return for funding, they have promised the fallen nation all the materia in Midgar, presumably as both a literal and symbolic returning of power to Wutai. As I spoke of earlier, Shinra also appears to be aware of this arrangement. If truth be told though, having Wutai operatives carrying out covert activities in Midgar is not new to episode INTERmission at all. There's a collection of soldier side quests in Crisis Core dedicated to eliminating a Wutai spy ring, with many of its members hiding out in the slums. The related mission briefs in the game even go as far as to say the Wutaians have joined forces with other anti-Shinra factions. One of these is almost certainly a branch of Avalanche. As a caveat to that though, the spy ring are remnants of the Wutai army, and no longer following the command of the nation's leaders. Yuffie's assignment in INTERmission, on the other hand, is the first verified instance in the compilation of Final Fantasy VII of orders like this coming from the top. As I mentioned, the dynamic of Yuffie's connection to Wutai has drastically changed in Remake, and I for one am excited to see where it takes us. Well guys, this has been my recap of the Easter eggs and compilation lore regarding Yuffie's introduction to Avalanche HQ. I hope you've enjoyed it, and please be sure to leave a comment with any feedback or something you think I've missed. If you haven't already done so, I invite you to check out my main Final Fantasy VII Remake video series, where I extensively break down the lore and Easter eggs chapter by chapter. Those episodes are funded by Kubicon and hosted on their YouTube channel. I'll leave a link to the full playlist in the description below. If you like these videos, remember to subscribe to both channels and turn on your notifications. And please also consider picking up a copy of my book, Norse Myths That Inspired Final Fantasy VII, which is now also available as a special edition hardback. The links to each edition can be found on my Patreon account, in addition to all my other projects, and I've noted this in the description as well. But until next time, take care. I'm MJ Gallagher, and I'll speak to you again in part 3.